Thanks to all of you out there who are, thank you for standing by. My name is Brent Sanjan. I'm from the Department of Agricultural, Environmental, and Development Economics at Ohio State University. On behalf of all my colleagues on the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach team, let me welcome you to today's installment of our monthly webinar series. We're delighted that you're with us for this presentation by Kevin Leahy from Duke Energy, titled Business and Climate Change, Still Trying. These webinars are an initiative of the Ohio State University Climate Change Outreach Team, a multi-departmental effort within Ohio State University. This is led by OSU Extension, Ohio Sea Grant, Bird Polar Research Center, and a number of other departments at Ohio State University. Before introducing our speaker, let me note just a few logistical issues. During the entire webinar, all participants will be in listen-only mode. However, we do encourage you to ask questions via the chat feature located on the right-hand side of your screen. Simply type your question and send it to the entire group or to me, and send your questions at any time during the presentation. Basically, what we'll do is I will collect those questions and ask them to Kevin during the question and answer session at the end. He does note if there are any questions about particular slides, feel free to send a query about those slides to me, and I'll go ahead and prompt him to answer those queries as we go. However, we will try to put most of the questions towards the end of the presentation in order to keep on time. We have more than 200 registrants on this webinar, a great diverse group representing governmental agencies, academia, nonprofit groups from around the country, etc. We really encourage you to keep those questions coming so that we can have a productive question and answer session at the end in particular. A final note is that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website for later viewing. Also, we'll post a webinar survey in the chat feature towards the end of the hour, and we really encourage you to please fill that out. When you see that, that will really help us to continue bringing you good webinars in the future, and you'll hopefully provide us with some new topic areas you'd like to see addressed. Well, now let me turn to today's topic and today's speaker. Kevin Leahy is Managing Director of Environmental and Energy Policy at Duke Energy, a leading energy company in the United States of America. Mr. Leahy is responsible for the formation of the firm's climate change policy. He represents the company in policy discussions with other firms, NGOs, and the broader analytical community. His previous energy sector experience includes management of energy market forecasting for traders and investment analysts, and renewable energy strategy, both domestic and international. Earlier in his career, he performed investment analysis for new product and market development for Cummins Inc. and their international operations. He also served with the Peace Corps as a volunteer in Honduras and a staff member in Albania. Mr. Leahy holds degrees in mechanical engineering from Purdue University, an MBA with finance concentrations from Indiana University, and an MPA from Harvard, where he studied energy and environmental policy. We're delighted to have Mr. Leahy here with us today. Thanks a lot, Mr. Leahy. Without further ado, please go on.
Well, thank you, first of all, for that kind introduction. You know, before I start, I want to say I participate in a lot of webinars, you know, in the audience, but never as a presenter before. So I have this vision of all of you there multitasking and checking your email and all of that. So I'll try to move this as quickly as I can and to hold your attention. But certainly if things are not going as you think they ought to in terms of speed and so on, feel free to email them or message the moderator for me to speed it up. So with that, my usual disclaimer, I'm not speaking for Duke Energy today, I'm speaking for myself. And numbers in this presentation are in a lot of cases approximations. Some of the data sets are old, but I'm really just trying to give you an idea of sort of where things are or have been or where they might be going. You can imagine as doing this and forecasting prices for traders, I get used to a lot of ambiguity. I'm also do a lot of translating of other people's work to put forward those generalized views. And then, you know, my final disclaimer is before you cite anything, I'd advise you to go to the original source and check it. Okay? So with that, Duke Energy today is a utility, primarily an electric utility company serving a big part of Indiana, the Cincinnati part of Ohio, a little bit of northern Kentucky, and then a good part of North and South Carolina. We also have some international operations in Latin America, individual power plants and such. We are going through a merger right now at Progress Energy, another electric utility located in the Carolinas. And if you look at the little map here on this slide, you can see the footprint of the company. We'll also have a good part of Florida should the merger go through. Our aspirations, as stated by our CEO, are to decarbonize our power generation system and to help our communities become hyper-efficient, as I like to say. And since a lot of folks I know on this call are interested or have been talking about climate change from a scientific point of view, I'll just state right off the bat that we have been consistent in our stated views about climate policy or climate science. In 2004, we put out a report while we were part of Synergy, where we cited a National Academy of Science report to the first Bush administration that said that the Earth is warming, continue to do so, et cetera, et cetera. In 2008, we were pushed by another group of investors to update our views on climate. And in that point, we cited the IPCC. So as we've looked at science, we've always had to ask the question, or answer the question, I should say, about who speaks for science, how is it formulated, what does consensus mean when we're talking about scientific issues, and so on. A lot of hazy things, but certainly we know from our own experience that a lot of people who claim to be experts, certainly when talking about the energy system, we would regard them as speaking nonsense. So we do have a filter of that we apply when we're thinking about these things and getting kind of inconsistent messages, let's say. So I was originally asked to talk about this issue in the context of sustainability, which is not exactly my field, but I went and looked at our own materials that we use because our company is, as we like to think, we apply sustainability in our thinking. This is from some of our official presentations. We think that sustainability unlocks innovation, which achieves the bottom line results and builds positive relationship, blah, blah, blah. So here's a generalized sustainability model that you can find out there. The sustainability being sort of the blend of economics, interest, stakeholder interest, and environmental interest, and kind of mashing those together and trying to arrive in this what I call the sweet spot where you can satisfy these different constraints. I would note that, and this is my own personal point of view, that the economics probably matter more than anything if you're talking to most businesses. This is only because we have a fiduciary responsibility to our shareholders or our owners. And if we're not profitable, we're not going to be sustainable, because basically if we have a management team that's sacrificing profits for the sake of sustainability, and I put sustainability in quotes, then our share price is going to be going down, and we're going to become acquisition bait, and the management team will be changed. So if you don't achieve the right balance here, you're not going to be able to continue to work on these questions or these problems for in a big way in the long term. Now the question is long-term or short-term profits. So certainly it may make sense to invest in the short term in things that don't earn a great deal of return immediately, but position you well for the long term. And I think that that's one of the ways that we can rationalize our involvement or the interest that we place in sustainability and trying to kind of optimize that long-term profitability. The other thing I would note is that certainly as we talk about sustainability and the economics of that from the firm's standpoint, we tend to be thinking about a tool that we tend to use more often than not is in the environmental economics. And that, I would say, is different from ecological economics, which I think if you look at some companies' literature and such, that they may be talking more about ecological economics as opposed to, strictly speaking, environmental economics, which is more of a classical economics orientation. So with that, sustainability has been a big driver for us in terms of our climate change position. So here I have sort of our objectives as we've been thinking about climate change and what we've been, or what we did push quite aggressively between, let's say, 2007 and 2009. And we did that in partnership with the U.S. Climate Action Partnership, or USCAP, which was formed in 2006. this is the membership role in '08, I think, when we were at our peak. We've had some companies leave since the issue's not really being worked very hard in Capitol Hill these days. But if you look over here at our objectives, the top one I have there is to resolve regulatory risk, and I'll go into that a little bit more in future following slides. But that is a very big issue for a company like ours that is subject to a great deal of what we call stroke of the pen risk or policy risk. We want to do this in a way that has the least cost, the least economic impact, market-based, market-friendly, less of what we call old-style command and control policies or regulations, which are really sort of the environmental policy set or tools that were used in the beginning in the 1970s, went away and were replaced, well, have been in the process of being replaced by market-based policies beginning in the late 80s, early 90s, through the Clean Air Act amendments, became what is now known these days as the very unpopular cap and trade. We wanted to avoid what we called the dash to gas. That was a very big issue for not only us, but our partners in the chemical industry and agriculture and so on who use natural gas as a feedstock. Wanted to advance technology, coal and nuclear provisions, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these things all these points were arrived at through an analysis and in support of what we thought was a sustainable vision for an energy future. So, as I said, sustainability for us is really about risk management, which, if we do that in a smart way, can enhance the value for our shareholders. So, if you look at this, a risk menu, we have to manage risk or uncertainty in what's going to happen, in lots of different arenas. We've got price risk of our inputs and the price of the power that we sell on the market. We've got demand risk, how much is demand for electricity going to continue to grow. Technology risk, what technologies are going to work out, what are those technologies going to cost. And then finally, what I've mentioned, and will continue to mention probably, is the policy risk. So what sort of technology restrictions will we be faced with through laws or regulations? What's the willingness of our customers to pay? Will we have restrictions on what fuels we can use? What sort of market structure will we face, et cetera, et cetera. So, and this all matters to us because, as you can imagine, these investments that we make are, each time you build a power plant, it's $100 million at least, sometimes up to $1 billion or a few $1 billion. And these assets last anywhere from 25 to 50 years. So we have to have a long-term outlook in terms of how we, what we decide to do today for this asset portfolio that we are responsible for managing. So our policy orientation has always been centered around the idea of, what are real problems that we're faced with? And this sort of goes back to this issue where I mentioned earlier, the scientific filter that we might apply, because lots of people have different perspectives of what problems we solve or create in refining fossil fuels or basic energy sources into a refined electron or a refined product that you might use. So we began with trying to figure out what are the real problems. Then we tried to develop a really solid understanding of the economics and the technology and all of the possible scenarios that might unfold. We do that in part by engaging with our stakeholders, in part to gather intelligence, because lots of people are looking at these problems from lots of different ways. We also, through the course of that, there's a sort of negotiation that takes place and an exchange of information that negotiation is based on. And the objective of all of that then is to begin to narrow these scenarios, these possible futures in the policy world, so that range of uncertainty is shrunk a little bit, so that it's not 20 different scenarios, maybe it's 5 different scenarios or 3 different scenarios that may or may not be unlikely. Now, we like to talk about our preferences that it's environmentally effective, cost-effective, and fair. So if you look at that phrase in light of this sustainability model, you can see the overlap: environmentally effective, cost-effective, and fair. All right. So, right now, today, we are faced in the electric power sector with an immediate issue that the current generation fleet that we own is getting old. There's about 500,000 megawatts of generation in the U.S., and you can see there 300,000 are fueled with coal. A lot of that is old, or getting older, I should say. The very large plants were built between the 60s and the 80s in that time frame. Not many big coal plants have been built since then, but there's about 100,000 that were pre-1960s vintage. Okay, now a lot of those plants are quite a lot smaller, a lot older. They're not as efficient, and because of that, they've been sort of the last ones in which we've made big investments in pollution control equipment. These plants don't tend to run all the time. They run only in times of very high demand, so primarily in the summertime, I would say, or in very, very cold weather. But they're responsible for the lion's share of the criteria pollutants that are emitted these days. So sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, mercury, and so on. So there are quite a raft of new environmental regulations coming down the road right now. I'm sure you see some of this talked about in the press these days. But because of those regulations, and importantly also because of the current price of natural gas, we're probably looking at 30 to 60,000 megawatts of these very old plants being retired in the next few years. Now we're going to have to replace that capacity. So the question is, what technology do we use to do that? So with that as a background, we're looking at that decision in knowing that climate is still one of these policy uncertainties that we continue to face. So this is a slide that I used in talking to some traders, energy and emissions traders. The points I was making were that the scientific community hasn't disappeared on this issue. They're still talking about it quite a lot. The physics are almost never challenged, certainly not within the scientific sphere. You can find things on the internet that might challenge it, but nothing from anybody who's publishing anything in the scientific literature. And there's a great deal of uncertainty and debate on the range of impacts. So, I stole this little cartoon here from Jay Golage at C2ES, used to be called the Pew Center Climate Change. But, so it shows the idealized view of uncertainty versus the view based on the climate sensitivity and observation. So we see that big fat tail there. Here's another nice little graphic that MIT has put out there where they've kind of converted the temperature range here on a world with no climate policies, put it into a roulette wheel, and then they put a roulette wheel looking at what the range of possible temperatures are if we have a climate policy. So their point in this is if you're saying that 2 degrees is sort of the absolute safe limit, that in fact more likely than not, even if we have some fairly aggressive policies, we're going to be above that 2-degree level. So the interest in this is that it's gotten more and more people, I think, to talking about, gee, maybe we need to consider a little bit of adaptation and so on. So, but that's not so much what energy companies tend to worry about. We tend to worry about the risk in terms of climate impacts themselves on the physical assets that we have. So that's difficult for us to know right now. And so there's a lot of hand waving in terms of what we talk about these physical impacts. So we tend to focus in more on the policy impacts. So with that, the policy risk and the financial risk that goes along with that is still something that we have to confront. As long as the science hasn't gone away and the weather doesn't give us, 10 or 20 years of mild summers, we don't think that this issue is going to go away. So in Washington right now, we're faced with a taboo in terms of talking about climate policy. It's definitely off the table on Capitol Hill, but that has not eliminated what we think of as substantial economic risk behind the policy. We believe that there's still very, very likely that we're going to be faced with restrictions on greenhouse gases someday. because of our understanding of regulatory options that are presented, and our own experience with market-based policies versus what we call the command and control-based policies, we know that the market-based policies are much more cost-effective, much more economically efficient. Pizer, I believe when he was at Resources for the Future, published a paper where he estimated that command and control policies were 5 to 10 times more costly than market-based policies, and we tend to believe that basic message. Okay. So with this policy uncertainty, basically what happens with that is that it's causing firms to delay big capital investments. If you don't know what sort of policy world you're going to be in, the value of holding off or not, instead of jumping too soon and making the wrong decision, the value of holding off or waiting begins to increase in your financial calculations. So we call that a delay option. And if you want to Google sometime real options in quotes, there's a whole field out there where they value physical assets in light of uncertainty and the option values associated with waiting or moving forward or choosing one path or another. There's a good macroeconomic example of what uncertainty does to an economy and looking at the impact of high volatility in oil prices. So there's been some good work, I think, done by Elder and Leahy with an article they published in Journal of Money, Credit, and Banking in 2010. But basically, they put forward that, and this is supported by other papers out there, that it's not so much the absolute level of energy prices that really knocks an economy on its back. It's the volatility in energy prices. So high price volatility is harder for businesses, harder for households than a steady price, even if that price happens to be higher. So I think that that intuitively you can think about that as the economic performance of Germany relative to a low-cost energy country, like for example us right now, relatively speaking. The German economy has been doing fairly well. So clearly that's one example or one piece of data that shows or can demonstrate that it's not just energy price that determines how robust or how much trouble an economy may or may not have. Okay, so those of us in the electric sector who have to replace these technologies, we're faced with terrific uncertainty regarding energy prices, energy price volatility, and then with climate policy looming out there sometime, some sort of price on CO2. So we're probably going to be delaying our investments, which is going to have an impact on the economy. This was not analyzed, I'll note, during the 08 and 09 debates on energy policy. So our challenge is, and what many of us are doing still is incorporating a CO2 price in our investment decisions. Now, the problem is we don't know what that price is likely to be. We don't know when that price is likely to hit us. So basically we look at lots of different scenarios. Maybe it hits this time and it's going to be aggressive, or maybe it hits that time and it's not going to be so aggressive, so on and so forth. And we look at what those different scenarios say, and then we try to hedge one way or the other. Now, certainly I would say that this fuzziness of when and how much makes it really, really difficult for firms to explain to their investors or even to our regulators. So in the electric sector, any kind of big aggressive investment that we might want to make in large capital intensive technologies like nuclear or CCS on coal, or even in some cases renewables. Although renewables you can chop up into fairly small parcels, we're not going to be able to necessarily deploy 20% of our portfolio into renewables right away with this sort of uncertainty. So with that, The delay option, as I noted earlier, increases in value, and we'll defer our investments as long as we can. If we have to invest, though, in the meantime, we're probably going to go for the lowest capital expenditure that we can, which means probably a combined cycle natural gas plant, all right? And I'll note here that if shale gas solves all the problems with natural gas that people, are concerned about and really does deploy, maybe that's not a bad deal. The problem is, or the nervousness that the sector feels, is that natural gas prices tend to move. This is the Henry Hub spot prices from 2004 to 12. I stole this from, I think, the state of Nebraska. So you can see how much gas prices have whipped around over the years. This was in 05. This was in 08 before the collapse. And here we are today. Okay. So these are prices that 4 years ago, if anybody had told me we'd have these today, I would have just thought they were crazy. I never thought we would see these kind of prices again in my lifetime. So this sort of movement and this history makes people in the power sector very nervous. It also makes people in the chemical industry and the ag industry very nervous when they hear us talking about deploying a lot of combined cycle natural gas turbines to generate electricity, because they, the conventional wisdom is, if the power sector starts burning up a lot of natural gas now, the natural reaction of the market is going to be moving north again. So people are a bit nervous about the prospect of the decisions that we might make in this front. So moving on, this is an analysis or an output of analysis that EPRI had done for us. EPRI is Electric Power Research Institute. As I tell people, this is where the industry tends to store its PhDs. This is an analysis of the electric sector looking at future technology and sources of electric generation that the sector would rely on going forward if we had CO2 controls. Okay? And given that many in the sector still believe we will have CO2 controls, we're still interested in what the shape of these look like. Now, it takes a little while to explain this sometimes. This is two different scenarios. Okay, the limited portfolio is a future technology portfolio where the industry, for whatever reason, doesn't build any more nuclear, does not, the technology on carbon capture and sequestration does not work out for whatever reason, or maybe the regulations don't work or whatever. But in any case, we just don't do CCS or nuclear. In the full portfolio, we're allowed to build nuclear, and carbon capture and sequestration works just fine, and the regulations work out, and so on and so forth. So we have those two big technologies we can use. All right. Now, this is based on a scenario where the sector, the electric sector, makes between now and 2050 reduces their emissions by 80%. Okay, both of these scenarios are 80% reduction scenarios. In this case, with the limited portfolio, you see this area is energy efficiency that occurs, so that the reduction in demand from the business as usual scenario or no policy scenario. You can see the amount of solar that is generated. Biomass grows quite a lot. Wind does. Coal goes away almost by 2025, which you can imagine that doesn't make coal states very happy. Natural gas grows for a while, but after a time begins to shrink also, because natural gas emits CO2, and with an 80% reduction target, it's not going to be able to compete. In the full portfolio, you see similar impacts. There's still a good deal of energy efficiency that's implemented. Good amount of solar and wind. You see a lot of nuclear, new nuclear, and old nuclear continues to operate. And then you see carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, retrofitted on some old coal, new coal with CCS, and then natural gas, some of which converts finally over to CCS as well. Now, the difference between these two scenarios is that there's less energy efficiency that comes out of the full portfolio than this one, and that's driven by the fact that retail energy or retail electricity prices are a lot lower in this scenario than in this one. The deployment of the nuclear in the CCS is at least according to the economic models and the technology assumptions that are used here, is a lower cost solution. So because the electricity prices end up being, I think on the order of, if I remember correctly, and I apologize for not having some of my tongue, but about 80% less costly here than here. All right. Inside the political debate, this issue of innovation is not well understood. This is also from EPRI, and I've included a link here, which you'll be able to go to if you want to go to the original presentation. But the ability to deploy these technologies here, but also solar and so on, drives the cost down of achieving the solution set, if I will. So here is the price of wholesale energy price of electricity in the limited portfolio scenario, where we cannot deploy those big technologies. Here is the CO2 full, the red line here, is the price of electricity if we're allowed to develop those technologies. Now you can contrast that to the reference case where we do nothing on a policy set. We just, continue to use the natural gas, conventional technologies that we have. Nuclear begins to go away because relicensing is expensive and so on. So you see, if we just stay on the business as usual track with no policy incentive or policy changes, we end up in about the same price world as we do with the CO2 policy where we are allowed to innovate. And that's something I don't think is well understood by policymakers, or probably even the public at large. So the world that we're in right now is simply sort of the business as usual case. There's no policy change, and with that, we're losing this chance or this opportunity to innovate or to learn and to continue to develop and drive down the cost of these newer energy sources. So the projects that would have gone forward, that were teed up, so to speak, in anticipation of a climate policy going through, are being sidelined one by one or mothballed. And mostly because few companies and few stakeholders are willing for folks to kind of make these multi-billion-dollar bets right now. So the rebirth of the domestic manufacturing that was, for example, behind what they call the nuclear renaissance of some of these large components actually being made on shore here in the U.S. instead of in Japan, where they are these days, is being deferred or canceled. And the innovation that we learned, that we gained through or developed through doing these large-scale projects and driving down the cost through an experience curve is just not happening. These are not the sorts of things that can happen in a lab-based environment. They have to happen through actual construction and large project development. So, with that, it sounds fairly gloomy, except there is what might be considered by some a bright spot in all this, is that simply the low natural gas that we're seeing right now, low natural gas prices are having a big impact on the electric sector right now. Natural gas is beginning to dispatch, or it's cheaper right now to run a natural gas plant in some cases than it is some of these more efficient coal units. So this is output from an analysis that the EIA did, their energy outlook for 2011, actually. These are the CO2 emissions for the sector. You can see the impact of the financial crisis right here. Emissions have come up since then, but the projection now is that with the low natural gas prices, that electric sector emissions are going to be something on this order here, if you can see my pointer. And this was with a $4 natural gas scenario. Right now, we're at about $2.50. Now, I don't expect that's going to stay that low for very long, because that's below the cost, I think, even to engage in any fracking. So I expect prices to come up. But you see, this is fairly getting close to the 17% reduction from the 2005 level for the sector. Now, this doesn't, it's not nearly what the emissions changes we would see if we had an economy-wide CO2 price, but at least in terms of a 2020 target and 17% below that, the electric sector at least is getting within the ballpark. These equivalencies here that I came up with are very, very rough approximations. So I would advise anybody who wants to talk about this to use caution. But basically, a rough rule of thumb right now, based on the sort of natural gas prices we're seeing, they're equivalent. The emissions that we're having now are equivalent to about an $8 natural gas with a $60 per ton CO2 price, or $4 natural gas with a $10 per ton CO2 price. So we're dispatching our fleets as though we were in this sort of a pricing environment right now, simply because gas is about $2.50. Now, the problem with this is that this doesn't provide the incentive, the economic incentive for us to continue the technology development in nuclear or CCS, and it doesn't do a whole lot even for renewables. So it may help in the short term with emissions in terms of the gas-coal competitiveness thing, if you tend to worry about those things, but it does not do a great deal for helping drive new technologies. Now, backing up a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about other this is a little bit of ancient history now, but in terms of the CO2 policy set that we had agreed to working with our partners at US CAP, one of the aspects of those recommendations that was, I know, fairly controversial for some folks was aggressive use of forest offsets. The electricity sector liked it because it took pressure off of the CO2 prices. The industrials liked it because it took pressure off of natural gas prices, which they were worried about. And the environmentalists liked it because it helped stop deforestation in developing country, which is for as many of you know, a big source of human-caused CO2 emissions. Now, the other thing that we inadvertently tripped over, I suppose, but we discovered through conversation, was that there was an upside to U.S. agriculture with this policy. And this was something that the ag sector was beginning to understand, but it was not soon enough, I don't think, to impact the final outcome in the policy debate. But if you look at these two maps showing the year 2000, the natural forest around the world, versus the projection in 2050 of the remaining natural forest around the world, a lot of this was, especially in Latin America, I know, was being converted to agriculture. Now, if we have forest offsets as part of a CO2 policy, as part of a global CO2 policy, you can imagine this deforestation doesn't happen. We're more in this kind of a world than that kind of a world. That being the case, the value of agriculture in areas where it already exists, I don't think so much in sub-Saharan Africa, but certainly in this area and this area, the value of the agriculture throughout these regions is much greater. Doesn't have a great impact on retail food prices in the OECD, but it does have some increase in wholesale commodity prices, and it makes agriculture in these areas more valuable. So from a political standpoint, this was something that did catch the attention of the ag industry, and they were on board and interested. From the automotive sector, and I'm not speaking for them, so you can take this as my own interpretation. The automotive sector was seeing this as an opportunity of supporting the efficient vehicles that they were being told that they needed to build. So you see here, this is a nice little diagram showing the monthly sales of hybrid vehicles and the running average price of gasoline and the monthly average price of gasoline. So you can see there's a correlation here of sorts between the price of gasoline and the public's interest in hybrid vehicles. Now, the exception is this spike right here in hybrid sales, which was, if you might remember, the the nice little incentive that the government created as part of the stimulus package. So the auto industry is interested in building products that people want to buy. If they're forced to build products because of CAFE standards and so on, they want a market where people are going to build those, or buy those, I should say. So there was it made sense to have gasoline as part of this whole package. Now, the price of gasoline wasn't going to change very much in the near term, but in terms of 2030, 2040, 2050, with everybody knowing what the likely price range was to be in that time, it was a good signal for producers and consumers to begin moving generally in the direction of greater efficiency and possibly even electrification. So my prescription of what might help in terms of the policy set is we need to do more work in terms of exploring the economic cost of this whenever problem, as I call it, the problem caused by the uncertainty and the delay in policy. And we need to engage more with the public to help them understand what we're talking about. Certainly business, as I like to tell people, is not a monolith. You can find lots of different factions, lots of different policy preferences, lots of different beliefs and values. So I like to remind people we're not all the evil polluters or the corrupt rent seekers, as we're frequently framed by one faction or the other. And finally, we just need to understand and engage those who oppose us in moving forward in these things so that we can better understand each other. Backing up a little bit more, I did want to cover briefly some of the sound bites that we faced during the policy wars or policy debates. When we were trying to advance climate policy, there were opponents who were talking about a $2.4 trillion tax increase, which you can imagine was very interesting to some folks. But this included all the estimated energy price increases through 2050, so it ignored any of the technology changes or incentives or anything else, or the tax cuts that were part of the policy set. The reality, in 2009, when we did our analysis, looking at the electricity price impact in a state like Indiana, where we have almost only operate coal plants, so it's one of the more carbon-intensive states, the policy set that we were arriving at, with the draft bill in the Senate at that time, would have caused about a $6 to $12 household monthly household impact, or as I calculated, 20 to 40 cents per day extra expenditure from electric bills. Average household. Gasoline price impact, rough rule of thumb, a penny per gallon for every $1 per ton CO2 price. So if we had a $20 ton CO2, which at that time we thought was not unlikely, an easy calculation, 20 cents. So the aggregate impact on somebody in Indiana would have been 60 to 80 cents a day. The real economic cost through some more sophisticated economic models would have been 80 to, let's say, $150 per year, or 22 to 40 cents per day on an NPV basis. Now, in the political debate, as economics were used quite effectively, I'd say, National Association of Manufacturers came out with an analysis of climate legislation as proposed by Waxman and Markey, showing some pretty significant hits here. I'll say that they used a real economic model, a valid economic model. Their assumptions were, I would term, somewhat conservative, things not working quite as well as we thought that they would, but legitimate scenarios nonetheless. They showed a decline of 1.8 million jobs, or 2.5 million jobs under the high cost case. That 2.5 million job loss became one of the big talking points out there. The other big talking point was this $1,250 cost hit per household. And those are numbers that tend to get people's attention. To kind of add fuel to the fire, or sort of directionally a similar sort of storyline, the Heritage Foundation also did an analysis of Waxman and Markey. They looked at a scenario that I call the wheels coming off scenario, where nothing worked. Couldn't get forest offsets. There was no real technology available. People didn't make changes in consumption to speak of, except for being hit by a very high CO2 price. So it was sort of an austerity-driven sort of policy, or a policy outcome, I'll say. A legitimate scenario. It's certainly something that was not impossible, but it was sort of an absolute worst case. It showed the job impact, similar order of magnitude, although achieved sooner, 2035 instead of 2050, I think. Back up real quick. Oh, this was 2030, so about the same time frame, and similar job outcome, but a pretty big hit at the front end, mostly because they projected a very high CO2 price right off the bat. And it would weaken the economy, as they said, with about shaving off about $700 or $650 billion from the economy. Again, legitimate economic forecast or projections. Now, the thing that they lacked was context. And I like to show this to people just to demonstrate sort of what was being lost in the conversation. They were kind enough, and you can find this online appendices to their analysis showing the underlying numbers. So you can see here the scenario, this dark band here at the top is the no policy world. Okay, so if the government did nothing in their model, their base case, the projected U.S. employment was this. If the government implemented the bad climate policy, the projected employment was this. Now, if you do the difference of these two numbers, it is indeed this number. Okay, it sort of shows folks a different picture. This is not, as some people have framed it, here's the projected GDP impact. This is not the economy of Haiti, as some were claiming we would arrive at if we did the climate policy. Here's the difference in household income. This is the $1,200 change in a sort of rising tide. Here's the Heritage Foundation's output. They did the same thing, provided the underlying data. You can see the no policy world up here and the very drastic climate policy impact on employment right here. So, this is really a storyline of not, decline. It's a storyline of arriving at the same point some months or a year later, maybe, in a model that is, I think arguably anyone in the financial business or in doing real investments in real assets would say this is rounding error. This is not something that you base a yes-no decision upon. So with that, I'll finish, but you see sort of what we were thinking and what we're up against in terms of how we message and the challenge in moving forward as we know we will someday.
Great. Thanks a lot, Kevin. That was fantastic. As you might imagine, we have quite a lot of questions here, so I won't waste any time talking. I'll just go right into trying to go through the questions, and we'll get through just as many as we can here. First off, there were some questions. If you went back in your slides, actually, to the early one where you had on the sort of three rings, and someone asked a question. I'm just going to ask two questions here. The first question was, have you seen a model that resembles a target with the environment on the outer ring, society in the middle ring, and economics in the center ring? This suggests that society exists within the environment and that economics exists within societies. So maybe it's a question just to comment a little more on this and maybe a different take on what that would look like. And then a related question is going to your policy roulette wheel. And there was a question about those policies and what policies they were talking about. And then after you answer that, there'll be a number of other questions related to that.
Okay. I've seen the model with the concentric rings instead of this Venn sort of diagram with the overlap. I have to admit I'm not a deep thinker on sustainability and how that works out. Certainly I think that it may make sense to look at it in sort of the embedded circles, but I can't claim to really be that deeply familiar with the implications of that. Quite often I think that as I've seen folks, that there's sort of that difference between the ecological economics versus the environmental that may be playing out in that case, but I could be completely off base on that front. But I'm sorry, that's not a very satisfying answer. The roulette wheels, the policy and no policy case, I believe the policy case was a world where the U.S. took an 80% reduction target. I forget what the rest, by 2050, I forget what the rest of the world did. It was a scenario where the rest of the world came on board in fairly short order. I think that, if I recall correctly, that this is based on the fact that there is so much inertia in the energy system itself that it's not something that can turn very quickly. And so just the physical constraints of deploying technologies and so on make it unlikely that we're going to arrive at a 450 ppm concentration level, that even a very optimistic scenario in terms of technology deployment and so on probably tops out between 500 and 550 if I remember correctly. I'd encourage you to dig into that. If you just Google climate and roulette and MIT, you'll end up at this site and can dig into it some more.
Great, thanks. So just a related question, maybe there were a number of questions actually that wanted to dig a little deeper into those specific policies and actions. So let me just sort of ask three of them and that were brought forward. First off is, could you talk a little bit more about what policy changes we would need to develop a sustainable electric generation sector? And then a related question was, could you expand a little bit on market-based policies and what you meant by that? And then finally, a related question to that is, what type of a sort of dollar per ton CO2 price would actually get these things to happen? What price do you think would get these things to happen?
Okay. Well, a sustainable electric system, sustainable is a hard word because I'll use my definition. A sustainable electric system is an electric system that provides the electricity whenever and wherever needed at a cost that's whereby the illumination or the heat or cooling or power to move your equipment is adequate and affordable for you, so you can still do what you want. And it's done in a way where the impact on the environment is fairly benign. I tend to believe that there's always going to be some impact on the environment. That's just a reality. If you're building solar farms, you're impacting the environment in that area because you're changing that landscape. But in any case, I think that in terms of, particularly if we're thinking about policies, it's one where we've kind of taken care of or resolved the uncertainty on the policy front regarding the emissions that we can put out. So presuming that we are in a world where we have to reduce CO2 emissions, then to me, a sustainable electric system is one where we're allowed to deploy the technologies that work, that are cost effective and so on. So, and that our customers agree is a good value for them. So that's that. What was the second question?
Could you expand a bit on market-based policies, and then what price would it take to really, in a market-based system, what price would it take to really get these new innovations to occur?
Right, sure. When we talk about market-based policies, we're talking about a policy set that uses an economic incentive that changes the market preference for us and our customers. So we prefer that sort of a policy as opposed to what we call traditional command and control. So command and control would be where the government would say, you can no longer use this technology. You have to use only this sort of technology, regardless of the application, regardless of the cost or whatever. So it would almost be the same as saying that the person who uses an air conditioner in Quebec, if anybody does, has to have the same efficiency rating on that air conditioner unit as somebody who uses an air conditioner in Florida. And you're doing it solely because of environmental reasons. Well, the person in Quebec doesn't run that air conditioner very much, so maybe it doesn't make sense for them to buy the hyper-efficient unit. Maybe their money could be better spent making some other sort of environmentally friendly investment. So if you think of that sort of analogy in power plants, that's sort of how we look at things. So a market-based policy is where there's a price on the externality, if you will, so that gets factored into our investment decisions. So what sort of technology do we deploy, and it gets factored into our operating decisions. So how much do we operate that technology versus this one if they both happen to be on the ground at the same time? So it's an economically centered sort of incentive, and we prefer that to direct subsidies typically, because frankly we don't think that those are sustainable from a budget or political standpoint. So a market-based policy that we were advocating during the climate policy debates were cap and trade, which is what we all just used to call emissions trading back when. But to have emissions trading, you put a limit on the supply of emissions that we are collectively allowed to put out from the use of fossil fuels. And then whoever wants to emit buys those allowances, and there's a market created, and from that market a price emerges, which then causes people to rationalize their investment and operating. So did I answer the question?
Yep, that was perfect. What price do you think would really work to get a lot of new technologies going?
Well, that's changed over the past few years, because in a natural gas world, or in a world where natural gas is quite high, you wouldn't need a very high CO2 price to incentivize the deployment of CCS or nuclear. In a world where natural gas is very cheap, that price has to be higher. So we used to talk about CCS being economic in the $30 to $50 to $60 price range. There's a lot of hand waving behind that number. Now I would say you could probably double that number pretty easily. So CCS is, in the near term, not immediately economic with these low natural gas prices, probably. However, if you are looking at trying to achieve an 80% reduction target, you're going to need that technology as quickly as you can. Presumably it takes us 5 to 8 years to really get a very large-scale test going, and you've got to test it a few times before you begin to roll it out in big numbers. So with that sort of schedule, the belief is that we have to move very quickly in order to have the technology ready for the 20s.
Oh, fantastic. So just a really quick other question here. We're running out of time, but how much time do you spend working with actual climate scientists? And you have a policy job, but do you spend a lot of time working with climate scientists?
Not really at all, no. I mean, I'm exposed to them, if I can say it that way, through conferences that I might attend, primarily at MIT. I'll also bump into them at conferences that the Pew Center might have, or other meetings that we might be invited to attend, to present at, or in policy discussions. We also, frankly, I try to monitor the discussion. Certainly, I'm very interested in anyone who claims that they have unraveled climate theory and that it's all a hoax, because, let's be honest, if it is indeed a hoax and it's going to unravel and everybody's going to see that, we'd be very interested in knowing that. As I tell people, we would probably have a big party if that were to happen. So we do keep track of those claims and try to track them down as to what's behind them and whether or not, what the response is from the folks who are actually working on climate else. So we look at that reaction and see if there's anything to it. But other than that, not a great deal.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Kevin. We'll have to draw it to a close there. We're at the end of our hour here, and we want to stick to our 1 hour. So I want to just have a few closing remarks here. I want to again thank Mr. Leahy for his outstanding presentation, and I would like to thank Ohio State University, NOAA, and the National Sea Grant College Program for funding this webinar. I do want to remind people that to take the survey for this webinar, the URL, we sent that out through the chat feature just a few minutes ago, and we'll send it out again. If everybody could go ahead and go to that site and fill out that survey, that would be really helpful. That will help us develop both the regional climate site as well as to think about future webinars that we might host. Up on the screen, you'll see the different sponsors of this webinar series. It's sponsored by the OSU Climate Change Outreach Team and a number of other partners here at Ohio State University. I do want to let everyone know that next month we're going to continue with Timothy Considine from the University of Wyoming, who will discuss the title of Balancing the Economic Benefits with the Environmental Impacts of Shale Energy Development. Finally, thanks again, Kevin. We really appreciate it. Thanks to all the participants. We appreciate you attending. We hope this has been beneficial, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thanks. Yeah, thanks a lot, Kevin.
My pleasure.